A perfectly drawn coastline appears on a map from 1513, a place no European had ever seen. This is not a simple mistake, but one of 30 ancient maritime charts that defy our understanding of history. These documents show continents and coastlines with impossible accuracy, lands that would not be officially discovered for hundreds of years. By the end of this journey, you will see a hidden pattern emerge, one that points to a lost chapter of human exploration. How did medieval cartographers map Antarctica without its ice? What forgotten civilization provided the original blueprints? What does our history books leave out about the world's true discoverers? The most famous of these impossible documents is the Piri Reis map of 1513, drawn on gazelle skin by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer of the same name. This world chart is a masterpiece of its age. Yet it contains a geographical nightmare for conventional history. In its lower section, the map shows a landmass that bears a startling resemblance to the coastline of Queen Maud Land in Antarctica. This is not the frozen, ice-locked continent we know today. This is a land with flowing rivers, temperate bays, and a topography that could only be visible if the land was free of its immense ice sheet. The problem is simple and profound. The last time Antarctica was in such a state was over 6,000 years ago, millennia before any known civilization capable of such a global surveying project even existed. Admiral Reis himself did not claim the work as his own. In the map's extensive notes, he openly credits his work to older source maps, including what he called the maps of the ancients. He was compiling, not inventing. This admission points to a terrifying possibility. The map is not an anomaly. It is a copy of a copy, a faded echo from a much older time. The historian Charles Hapgood championed this radical idea in the 1960s. He proposed that a sophisticated, prehistoric seafaring culture once mapped the entire globe, including Antarctica, during an ice-free period. Their knowledge, he argued, was preserved in the great libraries of antiquity like Alexandria, and fragments of it were copied and recopied by later cartographers, eventually finding their way into the hands of men like Piri Reis. The map's accuracy, when compared to modern seismic surveys of the subglacial coastline, is what turns a wild theory into a legitimate historical puzzle. How could a medieval navigator have charted a land that would not be discovered by the Western world for another 300 years, and charted it not as it is, but as it was thousands of years in the past? The Piri Reis map is not just a curious artifact. It is the first and loudest piece of evidence that our timeline of human discovery is fundamentally, perhaps deliberately, incomplete. Yet the map's depiction of a warm Antarctica is not its only secret. The debate truly ignites when we place it beside another chart from the same era, the Orontius Phineus world map of 1531. This map shows the southern continent in staggering, impossible detail. It depicts a massive, ice-free landmass with interior mountains, flowing rivers, and a recognizable coastline. The central feature even appears to be a large inland sea. Skeptics argue these are just lucky guesses or artistic flourishes, but the precision is chilling. When this 500-year-old drawing is overlaid onto modern subglacial surveys of Antarctica, the coastlines align with a degree of accuracy that defies coincidence. The mountains are roughly where our seismic instruments tell us mountains are buried under miles of ice. The rivers follow paths that would exist if the ice were gone. This is not one cartographer's fantasy. It is a second, independent witness from the 16th century, pointing to the same unthinkable conclusion. Both Piri Reis and Orontius Phineus seem to have been working from different fragments of the same ancient source material, a lost master map of the world from a time when Antarctica was green. The geological evidence adds a profound layer to this mystery. Core samples from the Antarctic ice sheet reveal traces of pollen and fossilized vegetation, proving the continent was indeed free of ice millions of years ago. The conventional timeline holds that it has been frozen for tens of millions of years, far too long for any human civilization to have witnessed it. But a minority of geologists supporting the map evidence point to cataclysmic events like crustal displacement, a theory where the entire Earth's crust can shift, moving continents into different climate zones. This could have plunged Antarctica into a deep freeze relatively recently in geological terms, perhaps within the last 20,000 years, a time when advanced human cultures could potentially have existed. Of course, mainstream academia remains deeply skeptical. The most common counter-argument is that these maps are simply depicting a theoretical southern land, a terra australis incognita that geographers had hypothesized about since the time of the ancient Greeks. They suggest the cartographers filled in the blanks with imagined geography, and any resemblance to the real Antarctica is just a fluke of circular map projections. Another argument is that the landmass on the Piri Reis map is not Antarctica at all, but a distorted version of the southern coast of South America stretched to fit the parchment. But this fails to explain the specific, non-existent bays and peninsulas on the Piri Reis map that so closely match the subglacial topography of Queen Maud Land, a coastline entirely separate from South America. The controversy ultimately forces a difficult question. Is it more likely that two separate cartographers using different source materials both produced incredibly accurate, yet completely accidental, guesses of a continent's hidden shape? Or does the simpler, yet far more radical, explanation hold water, that we are looking at the faded fingerprints of a forgotten seafaring people, a civilization lost to the rising seas and shifting ice of a prehistoric world, whose greatest achievement was a map of the entire Earth? The controversy surrounding these Antarctic maps is matched only by the storm of debate over a document known as the Vinland map. Discovered bound inside a medieval text in 1957, this parchment appeared to be a 15th century world map with one extraordinary addition. Drawn in the North Atlantic, west of Greenland, is a large island labeled Vinland. According to Norse sagas, Vinland was the name Leif Erikson gave to the coast of North America he explored around the year 1000. If genuine, this map would be the first known cartographic representation of the New World, predating Columbus's voyage by over half a century. Its initial discovery sent waves of excitement through the historical community. Early analysis, including carbon dating of the parchment, placed it firmly in the 1400s, seemingly confirming its authenticity as a medieval relic. The implications were staggering, suggesting that knowledge of the Viking discoveries had seeped into European cartography, but the map's story was about to take a dramatic turn. As scientific techniques advanced, researchers turned their attention to the ink. Traditional medieval ink was iron gall made from oak apples and iron salts. Under microscopic and chemical analysis, the Vinland map's ink told a different story. It contained significant traces of a synthetic compound called anatase, a specific crystalline form of titanium dioxide. This particular form of anatase was not commercially produced or available until the 1920s. The conclusion was inescapable. The ink used to draw the map was modern. The parchment was genuinely old, but the drawing upon it was a 20th century forgery, a clever deception using an authentic blank page from a medieval book. Most experts now consider the case closed, labeling the map an elaborate hoax designed to rewrite history for fame or fortune. Yet, even in its exposure as a fake, the Vinland map raises profound questions about our relationship with these historical mysteries. Why does the idea of a pre-Columbian map of America hold such power over us? Perhaps it is because the underlying truth it attempted to counterfeit, the Viking presence in the New World, is now an established fact. Archaeological digs at Elance Oaks Meadows in Newfoundland have proven the Norse did indeed build a settlement in North America around the year 1000. The forgery was built upon a bedrock of truth, exploiting our desire to find tangible, physical evidence for the lost chapters of exploration. Its deception is a cautionary tale, reminding us that the line between revolutionary discovery and clever fraud can be vanishingly thin, and that the hunger for answers can sometimes blind us to the facts. While the Vinland map was exposed as a forgery, another chart from the same era presents a puzzle far more difficult to dismiss. Published in 1558 by Niccolo Zeno, a descendant of the famed Zeno brothers, Venetian naval heroes, this map claims to be based on letters and charts from the late 1300s. It depicts the North Atlantic with a startling clarity that should not have been possible for its time. The coastlines of Greenland and Iceland are rendered with a shape and proportion that rival maps made centuries later. But the map's most explosive feature lies to the west of Greenland. It shows a land named Estatiland, described as a rich country with sophisticated cities, and to its south a place called Drogeo. For many researchers, these are not mythical islands. Estatiland bears a compelling resemblance to Newfoundland, while Drogeo seems to chart the coast of New England. If this interpretation is correct, the Zeno map is not just a map. It is a family's testimony, asserting that Venetian explorers reached the shores of North America nearly 100 years before Columbus and 130 years before the Zeno map was even published. The debate over its authenticity is a battle between two compelling stories. On one side, the map's supporters point to its profound accuracy. The depiction of Greenland is particularly damning to the skeptic's case. It is shown not as a simple, mythical blob, but as a distinct landmass with an accurate southern coastline, and most tellingly, as an island. This was a geographical fact completely unknown to mainstream European cartography in the 1300s, and not scientifically confirmed until the 19th century. How could the Zeno family have known this? The map also correctly shows a vast, ice-free region in southern Greenland, which climate data confirms was a reality during the medieval warm period when the Zeno brothers supposedly sailed. These are not the kinds of details a forger would casually invent. They are the subtle, correct nuances that suggest a genuine record from an eyewitness. The opposition, however, argues that the entire document is a clever 16th century fabrication. They suggest that Niccolo Zeno, seeking to bring glory to his family name, used newly available geographical information from early 16th century Portuguese and Basque fishing voyages to the Grand Banks. He could have constructed a fictional narrative placing his ancestors at the center of these discoveries. The map's occasional inaccuracies, like the strange orientation of some islands, are cited as proof of its invented nature. Yet this theory struggles with the map's most precise details, like the island like Greenland, knowledge that was not part of the common sailor's understanding even in 1558. The map sits in a frustrating middle ground, too accurate to be easily dismissed as pure fantasy, yet too anomalous to be comfortably accepted by mainstream history. It forces us to ask whether we are looking at a patriotic fraud or the smudged carbon copy of a genuine medieval logbook, a secret that the Zeno family guarded for generations before finally revealing it to a world that was only just rediscovering the lands their ancestors had already seen. The Zeno map controversy reveals how difficult it is to separate genuine secrets from patriotic fiction. But another chart, drawn centuries later with no claim of ancient glory, presents an even colder, harder fact. In 1737, French geographer Philippe Buach published a map of the southern hemisphere that should have been impossible. Unlike his contemporaries, who often left the southern polar region as a blank, mythical space, Buach depicted Antarctica with a specific and bizarre geography. He showed it not as one single landmass, but as two very large, separate islands divided by a narrow, frozen sea. For nearly 200 years, this map was considered a curious failure, a work of pure theoretical geography with no basis in reality. The continent, when it was finally explored, was a single ice-buried land, Buach was wrong, or so it seemed. The advent of modern technology changed everything. Mid-20th century, surveys using seismic waves and radar began to map the bedrock of Antarctica, the actual land hidden beneath miles of solid ice. The resulting image was a shock. The continent was, in fact, comprised of a major East Antarctic landmass and a smaller West Antarctic one, and separating them was not a frozen sea, but a vast, deep trough now known as the Transantarctic Mountains. When you look at Buach's two islands, their shapes bear an uncanny, almost prophetic resemblance to the subglacial reality. His frozen sea sits precisely where the massive glacial rift exists today. How could an 18th century geographer, working decades before any official discovery of the continent, have produced such a strangely accurate depiction? Buach himself was a meticulous academic. He never claimed to have discovered Antarctica. He stated that his map was a compilation based on a synthesis of many earlier exploration reports, particularly those from the voyages of French and Spanish explorers who had sailed the southern oceans. The official explanation is that Buach was simply a brilliant theorist. He took fragmented accounts of icebergs, sea ice, and distant land sightings, and he made an educated guess about the land lying beneath the ice. He was applying the scientific method of his time, and he got lucky. But the sheer specificity of his guess is what troubles this simple explanation. He did not draw a single amorphous blob. He drew two distinct landforms with a clear separation. This level of topographical intuition seems to go far beyond extrapolating from sailors' tales of pack ice. This leads to the more radical theory. What if Buach, in his exhaustive research in the French naval archives, stumbled upon something far older? What if he found fragments of those same ancient source maps that informed Piri Reis and Orontius Phineus? Maps that showed Antarctica not as it was in his time, buried under ice, but as it was millennia ago, when its true, bifurcated shape was visible to the original cartographers. His map would then not be a lucky guess, but a scholarly interpretation of a much older and far more precise geographical blueprint. The Buach map stands as a quiet, persistent anomaly. It does not shout about lost civilizations. It sits in the archives, a product of the Enlightenment age, yet it points a steady finger back to a mystery that we have still not solved. It suggests that the lost knowledge of the ancients did not simply vanish. It seeped through the centuries, waiting in forgotten libraries, only to be rediscovered by men who could not possibly understand what they were truly looking at. 5 years after Buach published his polar vision, another mapmaker on the other side of the world was compiling a chart of such staggering scope it defies belief. Created by the Ottoman cartographer Haji Ahmed in 1559, his world map is a masterpiece of precision that seems to leap centuries ahead of its time. The map's depiction of the western coast of the Americas is its first marvel. From the recognizable hook of Baja California all the way up to the intricate, jagged coastline of Alaska, the shapes are rendered with a clarity and accuracy that European maps would not achieve for another 200 years. This was an era when most European cartographers were still guessing at the details of the New World, often drawing California as an island or leaving the Pacific Northwest as a complete blank. Haji Ahmed's map shows none of this confusion. It presents the American West Coast not as a mystery, but as a known, surveyed territory. But the map's most explosive feature lies at the very top of the world. Stretching between Siberia and Alaska, Haji Ahmed drew a distinct, solid land bridge. We know this area today as the Bering Strait, a shallow body of water that has, at various points in Earth's history, been exposed as dry land. The last time this land bridge, called Beringia, existed was more than 10,000 years ago, during the last ice age when sea levels were significantly lower. This was a time of woolly mammoths and early human migration, an epoch that ended millennia before the rise of any civilization known to history. So how did a 16th century Ottoman scholar, whose primary sources would have been sailors and traders, know to depict a geographical feature that had been submerged for thousands of years? The conventional explanation is that it is a coincidence, perhaps a misinterpretation of vague reports about ice bridges or narrow channels. But the map presents it as a clear cartographic fact, a wide isthmus connecting two continents. This level of specific, anachronistic knowledge points to a far more radical possibility. Haji Ahmed, like Piri Reis before him, must have had access to a body of ancient geographical data, a source so old that it recorded the world not as it was in the 1500s, but as it was in a distant prehistoric age. His map feels less like an original creation and more like a faithful copy of a much older blueprint, one drafted by explorers who walked across a world we can only reconstruct through geology. It is a silent, inarguable document that places impossible knowledge in the hands of a man who should not have possessed it, forcing us to wonder just how many times this ancient knowledge was copied, traded, and hidden away before finally being lost to time. While Ottoman cartographers were redrawing the world, a parallel revolution in mapmaking was unfolding in the East. In the royal courts of Korea, a single document captured a world so expansive it shatters the idea of isolated civilizations. Created in 1402, the Cangnido map presents the entire known world from a distinctly Asian perspective. Its scale is breathtaking, stretching from Korea and Japan in the east all the way to a remarkably detailed Western Europe and a massive, recognizable continent of Africa. This is not a sketch of vague shorelines. Africa is drawn with a distinct triangular shape, pointing southward with rivers and kingdoms carefully labeled. Europe, though squeezed on the right-hand edge, shows the boot of Italy and the Iberian Peninsula with a clarity that should not have been possible for a Korean cartographer at the dawn of the 15th century. How did this happen decades before Portuguese ships would even begin their slow crawl down the African coast? The map's existence suggests a vast, intercontinental web of knowledge, a silent information superhighway that connected the great empires of Asia with the distant lands of the Middle East and Africa. This was not a network built by European explorers. It was the product of the Mongol Empire's Pax Mongolica, a period of relative stability that allowed goods, ideas, and geographical data to flow freely along the Silk Road. Arab merchants and scholars who had been trading down the east coast of Africa for centuries carried their detailed charts and travelogues eastward. Persian and Indian navigators added their own knowledge of the Indian Ocean. This collective intelligence was then compiled, translated, and synthesized in places like Korea, creating a composite picture of the globe that Europe was completely unaware of. The Cangnido map forces us to abandon the Eurocentric story of discovery. It proves that the world was already deeply interconnected, its continents and cultures mapped and understood by Eastern scholars working from a shared pool of ancient and contemporary sources. This map is not an anomaly. It is a snapshot of a sophisticated global consciousness that existed long before the age of exploration officially began. A consciousness that our history books have only just begun to acknowledge. But this flow of global knowledge was not confined to the courts of Asia. A few years before the Cangnido map was created, a Venetian merchant was crafting a chart that holds its own profound secrets. The De Verga world map, drawn between 1411 and 1415, is a stunning circular planisphere painted on a sheet of parchment nearly 2 feet wide. At its heart, it is a practical sailor's map, a portolan chart of the Mediterranean so accurate it could still guide a ship today. Its coastlines are defined by a web of precise room lines, the navigational grid used by medieval mariners. Yet, when your eye travels beyond the familiar waters of Europe, the map transforms into something else entirely. It ventures into the Indian Ocean, depicting a vast body of water dotted with islands and framed by the curved, recognizable coast of Africa. This is the real mystery. How did a Venetian cartographer, decades before Portuguese explorers like Vasco da Gama would brave that route, possess such a coherent picture of the Indian Ocean world? The map shows Africa with a southern orientation that suggests an awareness of its true shape, a knowledge that simply should not have existed in early 15th century Venice. This was not a lucky guess. It points to a hidden pipeline of geographical intelligence, one that flowed into the great trading ports of Italy. The information likely came from Arab merchants, the undisputed masters of Indian Ocean trade for centuries. Their dhows had been crisscrossing these waters, mapping the monsoons and charting the coasts from Zanzibar to India. Their knowledge, passed through intermediaries in Alexandria or Constantinople, appears to have reached Albertin de Verga. He was not an explorer, he was a compiler, a terminal in a vast, informal network that exchanged hard-won geographical facts for gold and goods. Yet the de Verga map also lives in two worlds. Alongside its startlingly accurate African coast, it faithfully includes mythical islands like Trapabana, a giant landmass often equated with Sri Lanka but blown out of all realistic proportion. This is the cartographer's dilemma. He is working with a mixture of hard, empirical data from Arab sources and the persistent mythological geography inherited from classical texts like those of Ptolemy. He cannot tell which is which, so he includes everything. This single parchment perfectly captures a moment of transition, a flicker of true global understanding breaking through the fog of ancient legend. It proves that the maps which would later guide the European age of discovery did not emerge from a vacuum. They were the final product of a long, slow synthesis of knowledge, a secret collaboration between cultures that history often remembers as separate and distinct. While the de Verga map hinted at secret knowledge, one Portuguese document took state secrecy to an entirely new level. The Cantino Planisphere of 1502 is not just a map, it is an act of international espionage. This magnificent chart, over 1 meter tall, was secretly commissioned by an Italian agent named Alberto Cantino and smuggled out of Portugal directly from King Manuel's own treasury. Its purpose was to deliver the most valuable intelligence in Europe to the Duke of Ferrara, the latest and most accurate Portuguese discoveries in the New World. What makes this map so explosive is its depiction of Brazil. Just 2 years after Pedro Álvares Cabral's official discovery of the land in 1500, the Cantino Planisphere shows the Brazilian bulge with a stunning, almost modern accuracy. It details the coastline from the Amazon Delta down to Sao Paulo, capturing subtle curves and capes that should have taken decades of coastal exploration to chart so perfectly. This is not a rough, preliminary sketch. It is the work of master cartographers working from precise, first-hand navigational data. The map's impossible precision suggests that the official story is incomplete. Could Portuguese ships have been making secret, unrecorded voyages to the South American coast long before Cabral's celebrated landing? Many historians believe so, pointing to the sheer detail on the Cantino map as evidence of a much longer, hidden period of exploration. The map's secrets do not end in the Americas. Its portrayal of Africa is equally revolutionary. It shows the continent's entire western coast, from Gibraltar all the way to the Cape of Good Hope, with a breathtaking fidelity. Most remarkably, it includes the island of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean, a place that would not be officially discovered by Europeans for another 6 years. This was the crown jewel of Portuguese exploration, the result of Vasco da Gama's historic voyage to India just 4 years prior. The Cantino Planisphere is a snapshot of a world being torn open, a moment when one nation's secret knowledge was so powerful it had to be stolen. It stands as irrefutable proof that the recorded dates of discovery in our history books are often just the moment a secret became too big to keep. The Waldseemüller map of 1507 is famous for one word: America. But that single label distracts from its true geographical heresy. printed in a small German town years before any European ship had sailed into that vast expanse. The map shows the Pacific Ocean. It depicts a clear, open body of water separating the New World from Asia, a fact that should have been completely unknown. The official story credits Vasco Núñez de Balboa with the first European sighting of the Pacific after a grueling trek across the Isthmus of Panama in 1513. Yet here it is, fully realized on a map printed 6 years earlier. The map's creator, Martin Waldseemüller, seemed to be working from a script of discoveries that had not yet happened. How did he know? His own writings offer a tantalizing clue. He credited the voyages of Amerigo Vespucci, the Italian explorer for whom the new continent was named. Vespucci's published letters described sailing far down the coast of South America, and he may have deduced that such a long coastline must imply a second ocean lying beyond it. This is the safe, logical explanation, but the map itself tells a more complicated story. It does not just show a theoretical ocean. It presents the western coast of South America with a specific, tapered shape that aligns eerily with reality. This is not a random guess. It is a confident assertion of a geographical truth that no European of the time could empirically verify. This leads to the more radical possibility. Could Waldseemüller have had access to secret Portuguese or Spanish charts, documents detailing voyages that were kept off the official record to protect trade routes? Or perhaps, like so many other cartographers of his era, he was incorporating fragments of a much older geography, a classical or even pre-classical understanding of the world that included both the Atlantic and Pacific basins. The map is a paradox, a landmark of humanism that simultaneously points backward to a lost knowledge. It celebrated the new discoveries of its age while possibly being guided by the ghost of a much older one, a blueprint from a time when the world's oceans were already charted. But the world map of Claudius Ptolemy presents a different kind of mystery altogether. Created in the 2nd century, his work Geographia was the ultimate geographical authority for over a millennium, a text so revered it was considered infallible. When it was rediscovered and translated into Latin in the early 15th century, it ignited the European Renaissance in cartography. Yet the maps printed from his instructions contain strange, impossible additions. Later editions, like the one published in Ulm in 1482, depict a vast, unknown landmass curling around the southern tip of Africa, stretching eastward into a great southern ocean. This was not part of Ptolemy's original vision. His own map ended with a vast, unexplored terra incognita. So why did Renaissance mapmakers, who slavishly copied his grid of longitude and latitude, feel compelled to add a continent that no European had ever seen? They were not just illustrating theory, they were integrating new, secret data. These cartographers had access to more than just Ptolemy's ancient text. They were comparing his work with the real-world charts carried by Portuguese and Arab sailors, charts that whispered of lands beyond the classical world. The southern continent on these later Ptolemaic maps bears a startling resemblance to early, fragmented reports of both the Americas and Antarctica, all squeezed into a single landform. This was the cartographer's dilemma made visible. They were trying to force a square peg of new discovery into the round hole of ancient authority. The result is a hybrid map, a document that pays homage to a Greek master while subtly betraying the existence of a far more advanced and mysterious source of knowledge, one that Ptolemy himself never knew. A decade after the Waldseemüller map hinted at unknown oceans, a different kind of cartographic masterpiece was being prepared as a gift for a king. The Jean Rots Atlas of 1542, presented to Henry VIII of England, is a breathtaking work of art and science, its pages glowing with rich color and precise detail. Rots, a hydrographer of the Deep school in France, created what was arguably the most advanced maritime atlas of its era. Its depictions of European coastlines are masterful, but its true mystery lies far to the south, in a sprawling, unknown landmass he labeled Java La Grande. This enormous continent, drawn just north of the Antarctic Circle, possesses a coastline that looks hauntingly familiar. Its eastern shore, with a distinct gulf and a protruding peninsula, bears an uncanny resemblance to the Gulf of Carpentaria and the Cape York Peninsula of northern Australia. The problem, of course, is timing. The first documented European landing on Australia would not occur for another 64 years with the Dutch ship the Defy in 1606. So what is this land doing on a French map from 1542, rendered with such confident detail? The charts of the deep school, like Rotz's, are notorious for this anomaly. They consistently show this great southern land, complete with rivers, mountains, and even notations about the naked, dark-skinned people who lived there. This was not a theoretical landmass dreamed up by geographers. It reads like a direct report from an eyewitness. The most compelling theory points to secret Portuguese voyages down the African coast and across the Indian Ocean. Portugal guarded its exploration records with obsessive secrecy, and it is entirely plausible that their caravels riding the Roaring Forties were blown off course and stumbled upon the western coast of Australia decades, or even a century before the Dutch. The detailed knowledge of the northern coastline on the Rots map, a region far from the later Dutch landing sites in the west, suggests multiple unrecorded journeys of mapping and trade. Fragments of this Portuguese intelligence, perhaps captured from a ship or traded in an Asian port, likely found their way to the mapmakers of deep. Jean Rots was not inventing a fantasy continent. He was compiling the best available data from the global networks of his time, data that included the carefully held secrets of Europe's most ambitious explorers. His beautiful atlas, therefore, is more than a royal gift. It is a silent witness to a shadow history of discovery, a map that shows a world the history books claim had not yet been found. The dulcet portolan chart of 1339 feels like a ghost in the history of navigation. Its lines are sharp, its coastlines of Europe and North Africa rendered with a clarity that would not be out of place on a map made 200 years later. The Mediterranean Sea is laid out with such precision that a sailor could use it to navigate from Gibraltar to the Holy Land with confidence. This sudden appearance of mastery is the central mystery. Where are its ancestors? Where are the clumsy, experimental drafts, the slow, painstaking improvements that should logically precede such a perfect document? It simply arrives fully formed, as if the knowledge was downloaded into the mind of its creator, Angelino Dulcet, from some unknown source. Portolan charts are defined by their web of room lines, a radiating compass, rows of directions that allowed navigators to plot a straight course across open water. The technique is sophisticated, a product of advanced mathematics and celestial observation. Yet the Dulcet chart shows no sign of being a first attempt. It is the work of a master, executed with a confidence that suggests he was working from a long-established tradition, a tradition that has left no other trace in the historical record. This is not how technology develops. You do not go from drawing vague, symbolic coastlines to producing an anatomically correct map of a continent in a single generation. The chart's accuracy is so profound, so out of step with its time, that it forces a difficult question. Was Angelino Dulcet a brilliant innovator, or was he the last inheritor of a much older craft, a secret science of mapmaking that had been perfected long before and was only now, in the 1400s, beginning to seep back into the world? The chart stands as silent, stubborn proof that our timeline of progress is missing a crucial volume, a lost age of exploration whose only surviving witnesses are these impossibly accurate pieces of parchment. Just a few decades after Dulcet, another portolan chart appears with an even deeper mystery. The Yehudi ibn Ben-Zara chart of 1487 is a Hebrew portolan, a detailed map of the Atlantic and its coastlines drawn by a Jewish cartographer. At first glance, it fits the pattern of its time, with a web of room lines covering the Mediterranean. But when you look north to the edges of the known world, the map reveals something inexplicable. It depicts Greenland not as a vague, mythical land, but with a startlingly accurate shape, complete with its distinctive, jagged eastern coastline. More astonishing than its shape, however, is what the map shows on the land itself. Ibn Ben Zara drew glaciers. He illustrated massive ice sheets creeping down from Greenland's interior, terminating at specific fjords and bays. This is a level of topographical detail that is completely absent from the more famous maps that would follow in the next century. By the time explorers like Martin Frobisher were mapping the region in the 1570s and 1580s, these particular glaciers had retreated significantly, leaving behind different coastlines. So how did a cartographer in 1487 know to draw a version of Greenland that was already out of date by the time it became a regular feature on European charts? The most logical explanation is also the most staggering. Ibn Ben Zara was not working from contemporary reports. He was copying a much older source map, a chart drafted during a colder climatic period when those glaciers were more extensive. This points to a source from the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that began in the early 14th century. His map, therefore, is a fossil. It preserves a snapshot of the North Atlantic from a time when the climate was different, a snapshot that was already a historical relic by the time he put ink to parchment. This single document does more than just show accurate geography. It captures a moment in the Earth's own history, a memory of ice written into a sailor's chart, suggesting that the original surveyors of our world were mapping a planet in constant, slow motion. Two names, King and Hamey, mark a pair of charts that deepen the North Atlantic mystery. These portolan maps, one from around 1502 and the other from 1508, are masterpieces of Mediterranean navigation. Yet their most baffling details are found far to the west in the icy waters of the New World. Both charts depict a large inland sea with a distinct, narrow opening to the ocean, a configuration instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with North American geography. This is the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the vast body of water nestled between Newfoundland and the Canadian mainland. The problem is one of simple chronology. The first documented European to explore this complex inland sea was Jacques Cartier, and his famous voyages did not begin until 1534. So how could these two maps, drawn a full generation before Cartier ever set sail, show the Gulf with such confident and specific detail? The entrance, the Strait of Belle Isle, is clearly defined, and the general shape of the Gulf mirrors modern maps with an accuracy that defies coincidence. This is not a vague suggestion of land. It is a precise hydrographic feature drawn by cartographers who seem to possess an intimate knowledge of a coastline that, according to the official record, was still terra incognita. The most plausible explanation points once again to the shadowy pre-Columbian voyages of fishermen and whalers, particularly from Portugal and the Basque Country. For years, historians have suspected that these pragmatic mariners, seeking the rich cod banks of the Grand Banks, had been making regular, unrecorded trips to the Newfoundland coast long before any official explorer claimed the land for a crown. They had no interest in fame or royal charters, only in profit, and they guarded their lucrative fishing grounds as closely as any state secret. The King Hamey and Hamey King charts are the likely result of this clandestine trade. A Basque pilot, after a season fishing off the coast, might have sold a rough sketch of the land to a cartographer in a European port. That sketch, combined with other fragments of intelligence, was then integrated into the sophisticated framework of a portolan chart. These maps were not declaring a new discovery for glory. They were practical tools, quietly incorporating the best available data for the use of other sailors. They stand as silent, compelling evidence of a bustling, unrecorded Atlantic economy that was already exploiting the resources of North America, while the courts of Europe were still dreaming of a passage to Asia. They prove that the mapmakers were often the first to know the truth, drawing the real shape of the world years and sometimes decades before the history books would catch up. These Portuguese masterpieces were not merely maps, they were official state secrets, each one a branch stemming from a single, hidden route. Locked away in a Lisbon treasury was the Padrão Real, the royal pattern, a constantly updated master chart of the world. It was the crown's most valuable asset, a detailed ledger of every coastline, current, and trade wind discovered by its fleets. The maps that were allowed to exist, like the Miller Atlas, the Rionel chart, and the successors to the stolen Cantino, were all direct copies or derivations of this secret master template. And when you examine this family of charts together, a terrifying pattern emerges. They do not show a world in the slow process of being discovered, they show a world already known. The Rionel chart from around 1515 depicts the entire Indian Ocean with a confidence that defies the official timeline of exploration. It shows the east coast of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and the west coast of India with a fluid, seamless accuracy, as if drawn from a single, unified survey. It even includes details of the Indonesian archipelago, a region Portuguese ships were only just beginning to penetrate. This is not the work of explorers tentatively feeling their way along unknown shores. This is the work of cartographers consolidating a vast body of pre-existing data onto a single sheet. The Miller Atlas of 1519 takes this impossible knowledge even further. Its depiction of South America is staggeringly complete, showing the Amazon River, the Rio de la Plata, and the distinctive contour of the continent's eastern bulge with near-modern precision. But its most haunting feature lies far to the south. Below the tip of South America, the map shows a vast, ragged landmass labeled Terra Australis. Its northern coastline is not a smooth, theoretical curve. It is a complex, fractured line of inlets, peninsulas, and bays, a level of detail that should not exist for a continent that would not be officially discovered for another 200 years. Even more startling, this southern land is shown connected to South America by a thin, curling isthmus, a geographical feature that never existed. This apparent error is the key to the mystery. It is a classic cartographic ghost, a telltale sign of a mapmaker struggling to reconcile two different source maps. One source, perhaps from ancient times, showed a southern continent in close proximity to South America. The other, more modern Portuguese chart showed the open waters of the Drake Passage. The cartographer, unsure which was correct, compromised by drawing a land bridge. This single mistake reveals the truth. The Portuguese were not just discovering new lands, they were colliding with an ancient geography, a pre-existing map of the world that included the true shape of Antarctica. How else could they have known to draw such a detailed, if partially misunderstood, southern coastline decades before Magellan's voyage and centuries before its official exploration? The Padrão Real was more than a compilation of Portuguese voyages. It was a living document, a palimpsest where the fresh ink of new discoveries was being written over the faint, stubborn lines of a much older chart, a global surveying project from a time lost to history. While European powers were guarding their secret charts, an empire in the East was compiling a map of staggering ambition. The Mao Kun map is not a single sheet of parchment, but a sprawling, multi-page chart included in the Wu Bei Zhai, a massive Ming Dynasty military encyclopedia from the early 17th century. Its true origins, however, are far older, based directly on the navigation logs of Admiral Zheng He and his legendary treasure fleets from their voyages between 1405 and 1433. This chart maps a world of breathtaking scale, detailing every coastal landmark, island, and sailing direction from China all the way to the eastern coast of Africa. The level of detail is so precise that it could have guided a ship from the South China Sea to the harbors of Zanzibar with unwavering confidence, a testament to the sheer power and reach of the Ming Navy. Yet, the most compelling mysteries lie not in what the map clearly shows, but in its shadowy edges and cryptic notations that hint at voyages far beyond the accepted historical record. Some researchers point to certain landforms and islands depicted far to the east and south of Africa, shapes that bear a provocative resemblance to the coastlines of Australia and even the Americas. One particularly controversial interpretation suggests a series of landmasses at the bottom of the map could represent the northern coast of Antarctica. The official history states that Zheng He's fleets never ventured into the Atlantic or the Southern Ocean, but the map itself whispers a different story. Could the great admiral's colossal ships, some of them over 400 feet long, have sailed past the Cape of Good Hope and into the vast Atlantic, catching the prevailing currents that lead directly to the coast of South America? Or did they turn south, following ancient trading winds to the icy fringes of a continent no one believed existed? The map does not provide a clear answer, but its very existence forces a profound question. Why would a military encyclopedia, a practical document for state power, include such detailed and expansive world geography if that knowledge had no practical application? It suggests the Ming Empire's awareness of the world was far grander than what was recorded in the official court chronicles, which were often edited for political reasons. The Maokun map stands as a silent, majestic monument to a fleet that could have circled the globe, a collection of sailing directions that may have led not just to known ports of trade, but to the very edges of the world itself. But the Piri Reis map was not the only chart to capture this phantom coastline. 2 decades later, the Orontius Phineus world map of 1531 presented an even more detailed and terrifying vision of the South. It depicts Antarctica not as a vague outline, but as a living, breathing continent. Its surface is carved with deep river valleys. Its interior rises into distinct mountain ranges, and its coast is indented with bays and inlets that could only exist if the land were completely free of ice. This is not a theoretical landmass, it is a topographical survey. The central region even features what appears to be a large inland sea, a feature that modern subglacial scans have since confirmed lies buried beneath the ice. How could a 16th century scholar, whose contemporaries were still drawing sea monsters in uncharted waters, possess such an intimate and accurate portrait of a continent that would remain hidden for centuries? The answer seems to lie not in the map itself, but in its origins. Orontius Phineus, like Piri Reis, was an academic compiler. He openly wrote that his work was a synthesis of many ancient and medieval sources. He was not claiming to have discovered this land. He was simply copying the best information available to him, information that described Antarctica in a state of warmth and fertility. When his drawing is compared to modern subglacial surveys, the correlation is beyond startling. The mountain ranges on his map align with the massive Gambetsev mountain range buried under 2 miles of ice. The rivers follow the paths of ancient subglacial valleys. His inland sea sits where radar has revealed vast, liquid lakes sealed beneath the frozen surface. This level of precision cannot be explained away as a lucky guess or an artistic whim. It is the kind of detail that could only come from a direct, on-the-ground survey of the continent. This forces a chronology that shatters our understanding of human history. The last time Antarctica was in such an ice-free state, according to mainstream geology, was millions of years ago. Yet here is a map from the 1500s, drawn with knowledge that seems to peer directly into that distant green past. The existence of both the Piri Reis and Orontius Phineus maps, 2 independent works from the same era pointing to the same impossible reality, suggests they were both working from different fragments of a much older master source map. This lost blueprint must have been created by a civilization with the seafaring technology to circumnavigate the globe and the scientific knowledge to chart its lands with breathtaking accuracy. A civilization that witnessed the world not as it is, but as it was in a prehistoric age, and whose only legacy is these faded echoes on medieval parchment. But the phantom islands on these charts were not limited to the far south. In 1436, the Venetian cartographer Andrea Bianco produced a world map that confidently places a large, rectangular island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He labeled it Antillia, a name that would echo through the age of exploration. This was not a tiny speck, but a substantial landmass drawn west of the Azores and oriented north to south, almost like a stepping stone between Europe and Asia. For over a century, this island and others like it were permanent fixtures on the most reputable nautical charts, believed to be real places waiting to be found. The legend that grew around Antillia was as detailed as its coastline. It was known as the Island of the Seven Cities, supposedly founded by 7 Christian bishops fleeing the Moorish conquest of the Iberian Peninsula in the 8th century. According to the tale, they sailed west into the unknown ocean, each establishing their own city on a rich and fertile land, vowing never to return. This story was not a vague myth. It was a specific, compelling narrative that drove real expeditions. Explorers like Pedro de Velasco in 1484 were granted royal licenses to search for these 7 cities, and the promise of Antillia likely fueled the ambitions of Christopher Columbus himself. But how did such a specific legend, attached to such a specific cartographic feature, come to exist? These phantom islands are far more than just cartographic errors. They are likely distorted memories, the faded echoes of actual lands visited by pre-Columbian explorers, but never properly charted or understood. A Portuguese ship blown far off course by a storm might have glimpsed the wooded shoreline of Newfoundland or the Bahamas. They would have had just enough time to note its general size and orientation before being swept back to sea. Returning home, the sailors' frantic, second-hand descriptions would be all a cartographer had to work with. A large land with trees somewhere to the west, the mapmaker would then do his best drawing a generalized shape and giving it a name from the popular legends of the day, a name like Antillia. Over decades, the real but fleeting sighting and the powerful myth would fuse into a single, unquestioned truth on the map. This process explains why Antillia and islands like it slowly vanished from charts in the 16th century. As European ships finally began to properly map the Caribbean and the North American coast, they realized that this specific, rectangular Antillia did not exist. The Phantom Island had served its purpose. It was a placeholder, a cartographic marker for a real discovery that had not yet been fully understood, a memory of a land seen but not yet claimed, waiting for history to catch up to the rumor. A decade before Columbus would even plan his voyage, the Grazioso Benincasa Atlas of 1470 was already charting a world of secrets. This Italian portolan atlas, a collection of beautifully rendered sea charts, presents the Mediterranean with the crisp accuracy expected of its kind. But when its pages turn to the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, the map transforms. Sprinkled across the empty Western Sea are islands that modern geography tells us do not exist. The most prominent of these is the legendary island of Brasil, drawn not as a tiny speck, but as a substantial circular landmass rising from the ocean west of Ireland. For centuries, historians dismissed these features as pure mythology, the cartographer's fancy filling in the terrifying blank spaces of the map. But what if we have been reading these charts all wrong? These phantom islands were not just decorative fantasies. They were precise points on a hidden grid, navigational markers for a transoceanic route that was known only to a privileged few. The circular island of Brasil, always depicted in the same general location on dozens of different charts, served a critical purpose. In an age before precise longitude, a sailor crossing the Atlantic would sail north to a specific latitude, then turn west. If he knew of a large island like Brasil at a certain sailing distance, it became a vital waypoint, a confirmation that he was on the correct, lonely path across the ocean. The consistency of its placement suggests this was not a guess, but a recorded fact, a coordinate passed from one experienced pilot to another in the strictest confidence. Who were these pilots? They were likely the fishermen of Bristol and the Basque whalers, men who pursued cod far into the Western Ocean. Their voyages were commercial secrets, never recorded in royal chronicles, but their knowledge was the most valuable currency in any port tavern. A cartographer like Benincasa, working in the great maritime hub of Ancona, would have had access to these sailors' logs and whispered reports. He would take their descriptions of a heavily wooded shoreline glimpsed through the fog and translate it into the symbolic, circular form of Brassel on his chart. This was not an act of invention but of coding. The map was a key, and only those who knew how to read it could unlock the path to the rich fishing grounds of the Grand Banks, grounds that lay just beyond the horizon from where Brassel was drawn. The Benincasa Atlas, therefore, is not a map of the world as it was imagined. It is a map of the world as it was known to a shadowy guild of Atlantic mariners, a world where the line between myth and navigational fact was the difference between a lost ship and a fortune made in silence. The Jorge Rienel chart of 1519 holds a secret that changes everything about the first circumnavigation of the globe. This Portuguese portolan chart, believed to have been carried by Magellan himself, depicts the southern tip of South America with a chilling and impossible clarity. There, drawn with confident lines, is the winding, treacherous passage we now call the Strait of Magellan. The problem is one of simple, earth-shattering timing. Magellan's fleet would not discover and navigate that very strait until October of 1520, a full year after this map was supposedly drawn. So how could a chart predate the discovery of the route it so accurately describes? The official story tells us that Magellan embarked on a desperate gamble, sailing south into the unknown based on a theoretical hope that a passage existed. But the Rienel chart suggests a far more calculated reality. This was not a voyage of blind discovery. It was a military expedition following a known, if perilous, route. The evidence is right there on the parchment. The chart shows the strait's complex, fragmented network of channels, a geographical reality that defies any lucky guess. This level of detail points to a prior, unrecorded reconnaissance, a secret Portuguese voyage that had already mapped the gateway to the Pacific. Portugal, locked in a fierce rivalry with Spain, would have had every reason to hide this knowledge. The Treaty of Tordesillas had divided the unknown world between the two powers, and a southern passage to the spice-rich Indies was the ultimate prize. Admitting they had already found it would have forced them to share the route, so the knowledge was buried, hidden away in the Padrão reel, only to surface on a chart like Rienel's for the eyes of a chosen few. This single document transforms Magellan from a daring explorer into a man executing a plan, a captain following a map to a destination that, according to all public records, was still a mystery. It forces us to confront a staggering possibility. The greatest voyage of discovery in human history was not a journey into the unknown, but a calculated walk down a path that had already been mapped in secret. The Diogo Ribeiro map of 1529 stands as the official Spanish answer to Portugal's secret master chart. As the new Padrón reel for the Spanish crown, it was the legal and navigational authority for every ship sailing under the Spanish flag, a synthesis of the most cutting-edge geographical intelligence the empire possessed. Its primary source was the monumental, if tragic, voyage of Magellan's fleet, the first to circumnavigate the globe. The map incorporates the precise track of that journey, etching the path through the strait, across the Pacific, and into the Philippines with the confidence of hard-won experience. Yet, when you look beyond the route of that famous expedition, the map reveals knowledge that Magellan could not possibly have brought home. Its depiction of the Moluccas, the famed Spice Islands, is unnervingly precise. The archipelago's complex arrangement of islands is rendered with a clarity that goes far beyond the vague reports from Magellan's surviving crew. They had visited only a handful of islands and under duress, yet this map presents the entire region as if viewed from above. This accuracy points to a hidden source, a leak in the wall of secrecy Portugal had built around its Eastern Empire. The most likely explanation is espionage. Spanish agents operating in the vital trading ports of the East Indies, or perhaps even in Lisbon itself, managed to acquire Portuguese charts detailing the true layout of the spice-producing heartland. But there is another, even more intriguing possibility. The map's fine-grained detail, the specific curves of coastlines, and the placement of small, insignificant islands bears the hallmark of local knowledge. It is the kind of information you would not get from a stolen Portuguese chart, but from the indigenous pilots who had sailed these waters for generations. Their understanding of the archipelago was intimate and born of 1,000 trading voyages in outrigger canoes, knowledge that was then translated and carefully integrated into the Spanish master map. The Diogo Ribeiro map is therefore a document of collision and synthesis. It is the official record of a Spanish triumph, built upon the secret theft of Portuguese intelligence, which was itself likely compiled from the ancient, unrecorded wisdom of Asian mariners. It proves that the true map of the world was not being drawn in European courts, but was being slowly, painfully reassembled from 1,000 scattered fragments, a global jigsaw puzzle whose original pieces had been lost to time. Yet the story of the Vinland map is far from settled. A small but persistent group of scholars and researchers continue to argue for its authenticity, pointing to a series of compelling anomalies that the forgery theory struggles to fully explain. The primary evidence against it, the anatase in the ink, is not the open and shut case it first appears. While anatase is a modern industrial product, this specific mineral can also form naturally. It has been found in medieval manuscripts from other periods, created by the corrosion of iron gall ink over centuries. Could the anatase in the Vinland map be a natural byproduct of its aging, rather than proof of a 20th century deception? The chemical analysis remains fiercely contested, with some experts suggesting the testing methods themselves could have contaminated the tiny, irreplaceable samples. Beyond the ink, the map's content presents its own puzzle. The depiction of Greenland is strangely anachronistic, showing it as an island, a geographical fact not confirmed by Europeans until the 19th century. A forger in the 1950s, working from the historical knowledge available at the time, would almost certainly have drawn Greenland as a peninsula attached to the Arctic, which was the common belief for centuries. Why would a fraudster intentionally get such a major detail wrong, making their forgery less convincing to contemporary experts? The map's portrayal of Vinland itself is another curious detail. It is rendered with a crude, almost tentative line, unlike the confident strokes defining Europe and Africa. This hesitancy feels genuine, as if a medieval cartographer was sketching a place he knew only from second-hand sagas, not inventing a geography from whole cloth. Why would a modern forger, aiming to create a sensational discovery, make the most important part of the map look so unconvincing and vague? The argument from motive is perhaps the most powerful. The Vinland map was not an immediate sensation. When it first appeared, many scholars were deeply skeptical. A forger typically seeks fame, fortune, or to prove a point. Yet this map, if it is a fake, was an act of incredible sophistication and risk with a strangely muted payoff. It required an expert knowledge of medieval parchment, ink chemistry, and obscure Norse history, all to create an artifact that initially convinced almost no one. This does not feel like the work of a charlatan seeking glory. It feels like the kind of complex, frustrating, and ambiguous object that genuine history often leaves behind. The possibility remains that we are not looking at a clever fake, but at a genuine 15th century document that recorded the Norse discoveries, using materials and techniques we still do not fully understand. Its continued controversy is a testament to the fact that some historical mysteries refuse to be neatly solved, standing as permanent challenges to our certainty about the past. Admiral Piri Reis was remarkably transparent about where his knowledge came from. In the extensive notes that accompany his map, he did not claim the work as his own original creation. Instead, he meticulously listed his sources, crediting a collection of charts that sound like the library of a lost world. He spoke of Arab maps, of Portuguese charts showing the new discoveries in India and China, and most incredibly, he referenced a map from the time of Alexander the Great. This is not a passing mention. He specifically credited a chart drafted by the geographers of the Macedonian Empire, a document that would have been over 1,800 years old when he was writing. This single reference shatters the conventional timeline of exploration. Alexander's empire stretched from Greece to India, a vast domain, but it never reached the Americas, and it certainly never sailed to an ice-free Antarctica. So what was depicted on this ancient map that allowed Piri Reis to so accurately draw a world unknown to 15th century Europe? The reference to Arab and Chinese sources makes perfect historical sense. Arab traders were the undisputed masters of the Indian Ocean, their navigational charts precise and closely guarded. Chinese Admiral Zheng, his fleets had recently mapped the world from their perspective, and their knowledge could have traveled west along the Silk Road. But the map from Alexander's era points to something far deeper, a foundational layer of geography that all these later cultures might have been drawing from. It suggests the existence of a primordial master world map, a single, unified survey of the entire planet from a time so deep in antiquity that we have no record of the civilization capable of such a feat. This was not a single map, but a tradition, a body of knowledge that was copied, traded, and preserved in the great libraries of the ancient world from Alexandria to Baghdad. When those libraries burned, the original maps were lost, but their essential data, the coastlines and continents, survived as faded copies in the hands of Arab sailors, Chinese scholars, and eventually an Ottoman admiral. Piri Reis was not a discoverer. He was the last link in a very long chain, a compiler who had the rare fortune to see multiple fragments of this lost global picture at once, and the skill to stitch them back together into a map that contained secrets its own creator could not possibly understand. The phantom island of Friesland clung to maps for nearly 300 years, a stubborn ghost in the North Atlantic. On the Zeno map, it was not a tiny speck but a substantial, detailed landmass drawn squarely between Iceland and the mythical Estatiland. For generations of European navigators, its existence was an unquestioned fact, a vital waypoint on their mental chart of the ocean. Yet no ship sailing its described coordinates today finds anything but empty, rolling waves. So what were these experienced cartographers and sailors actually seeing? The most compelling explanation is not that they invented Friesland, but that they misidentified a real place, their era fossilized by the slow, imperfect process of copying maps. One strong candidate is the Faroe Islands. Imagine a Portuguese caravel, its sails torn by a North Atlantic gale, glimpsing a jagged coastline through the rain and fog. The pilot, fighting for survival, makes a rough sketch in his log, noting a large, mountainous land. When that sketch reaches a cartographer in Lisbon or Venice who has never been to those fierce waters, the interpretation begins. The scattered archipelago of the Faroes, with its dramatic cliffs, could easily be consolidated into a single, large island on a map, especially when drawn from a sailor's frantic, second-hand description. Friesland became a cartographic magnet, attracting every vague report of land in that part of the ocean. Another possibility is even more profound. Some of the descriptions of Friesland, its size and location, bear a strange resemblance to parts of southern Greenland. A ship blown far off course could have encountered this icy shore, and its crew, completely disoriented, reported a new island. The Zeno map itself may have been a victim of this very confusion, compressing multiple real landfalls, the Faroes perhaps a sighting of Greenland, and the actual Newfoundland into a single, confused narrative. The persistence of Friesland teaches us a crucial lesson about these ancient charts. They were not works of fiction, but they were works in progress, layered documents where a single error, once inscribed on a respected map, could be copied for centuries, its fictional coastline gaining the weight of truth with every reproduction. It shows us that the line between discovery and misunderstanding was incredibly thin, and that sometimes the phantoms on the map are not lies, but simply lost travelers forever trying to find their way home. The Buach map presents a fascinating alternative to the ancient knowledge theory. Its uncanny depiction of a bifurcated Antarctica could be explained not by lost charts, but by the dominant geographical theory of its time. In the 18th century, many leading thinkers believed in a principle of global symmetry. They argued that the continents of the Northern Hemisphere must be balanced by equivalent landmasses in the south to ensure the Earth's stability. This concept of a vast terra australis incognita was not just a cartographic placeholder, it was a scientific prediction. Philippe Buach was a respected geographer, a man deeply immersed in this intellectual current. He meticulously studied the reports from explorers who had sailed the southern oceans, accounts that described vast fields of pack ice and towering, distant icebergs. From these clues, Buach made a brilliant deduction. He reasoned that such massive ice formations could only originate from a significant landmass and not just a single one. Observing how the northern continents were often separated by seas, he theorized that the southern continent would mirror this pattern. His map, showing two large islands divided by a frozen channel, was a logical application of this symmetrical worldview. It was an educated guess of breathtaking scope, so when modern subglacial surveys revealed Antarctica's true division, it appeared Buach was miraculously correct. But was this evidence of lost knowledge, or simply a case of a scholar making an incredibly lucky inference? The theory of symmetrical landmasses was ultimately wrong, a beautiful idea disproven by later exploration. Yet in this single instance, for this one feature, it produced a result that aligns with reality. This possibility does not diminish Buach's intellectual achievement, it reframes it. His map stands as a monument to the power of human reason, a moment where a flawed theory accidentally stumbled upon a profound truth. It challenges us to consider whether the echoes we see in these ancient charts are the whispers of a lost civilization, or simply the remarkable, if random, successes of the brilliant, questioning minds of the past. These impossible charts were not drawn by guesswork or artistic flair. They are the products of a terrifyingly sophisticated science, demanding a mastery of mathematics that should not have existed for centuries. To create a world map of such accuracy, a cartographer must first solve the fundamental problem of representing a spherical planet on a flat sheet of parchment. This requires spherical trigonometry, a branch of mathematics that deals with triangles on the surface of a sphere. It is the complex geometry that allows you to calculate the true distance between 2 points on a curved Earth and to translate those positions onto a two-dimensional grid. Without it, any map covering a large area becomes a distorted mess, with continents stretched into unrecognizable shapes. Yet, the precise coastlines on charts like those of Piri Reis or the Zeno family suggest their creators possessed this knowledge, a knowledge mainstream history credits to mathematicians of the 17th and 18th centuries. Even more baffling is the issue of longitude. Any sailor can determine their latitude, their north-south position, by measuring the angle of the sun or the North Star. But knowing your east-west position, your longitude, is an entirely different and far more difficult challenge. It requires knowing the precise time difference between your current location and a fixed point like your home port. A discrepancy of just 4 minutes translates to a navigational error of over 100 kilometers at the equator. The first reliable marine chronometer, a clock that could keep accurate time at sea, was not invented until the 1700s. So how did the source maps for these ancient charts accurately place continents thousands of kilometers apart with such stunning east-west precision? The coastlines of South America and Africa on the Cantino planisphere are not just roughly correct in shape, they are correctly positioned relative to each other. This implies the original surveyors had a method for determining longitude that we do not understand, a technology or technique lost to history. Perhaps they used complex lunar observations or a global network of astronomical alignments that we can no longer decipher. The very existence of these charts forces a single, staggering question. Who were these original mapmakers? They were not just brave explorers. They were brilliant scientists and mathematicians who viewed the entire Earth as a single, measurable entity. They possessed a unified theory of the planet and the technical skill to render it, leaving behind not grand monuments, but quiet lines on a parchment that whisper of a civilization whose true capabilities we are only now beginning to glimpse. Taken together, these 30 charts form a chorus of impossible knowledge. The consistent depiction of Antarctica free of ice, the precise longitude of continents, the accurate coastlines of lands undiscovered for centuries, and the phantom islands that guided real voyages all point to a single, inescapable conclusion. This is not a series of isolated mistakes or lucky guesses. The sheer volume and internal consistency of these anomalies across different cultures and centuries creates a pattern too strong to ignore. One map showing an impossible coastline could be a fluke, 2 could be a strange coincidence, but 30, from Ottoman admirals to Venetian merchants, from French academics to Korean scholars, creates a weight of evidence that demands a radical explanation. The simplest answer, however unsettling, is that our history is wrong. These charts are not original works. They are copies, the faded carbon copies of a much older master blueprint of the world. They suggest the existence of a sophisticated, global maritime civilization in prehistory, a culture with the ships to cross every ocean and the mathematical genius to map the entire sphere of the Earth with stunning accuracy. This was not a single empire in the sense of Rome or Persia. It was likely a network of seafaring peoples, a lost age of exploration that flourished thousands of years before the pharaohs, whose knowledge became the foundation for all later cartography. Their original maps, drawn on materials long since crumbled to dust, were preserved as priceless treasures in the great libraries of the ancient world. When those libraries burned at Alexandria and elsewhere, the master charts were lost, but not before dedicated scholars and navigators had frantically copied fragments of this sacred geography. These copies were then traded, stolen, and hidden, passing from the hands of Alexandrian scholars to Arab navigators, from Chinese admirals to Portuguese spies, and finally to the mapmakers of the Renaissance, who dutifully reproduced coastlines they could not possibly understand. They were drawing the ghost of a world that had vanished, a world their own civilization had not yet rediscovered. This is why a medieval portolan chart can feel like a modern map, and why an 18th century academic could draw a continent he never saw. They were all consulting different pages from the same lost atlas. This idea fundamentally rewrites the human story. It moves the age of global discovery from a recent European achievement to a primordial human event, a forgotten golden age swallowed by rising seas, climatic shifts, or perhaps a cataclysm that reset civilization itself. The evidence has been hiding in plain sight all along, etched on parchment and vellum, waiting for us to finally see the pattern. These 30 ancient maritime charts are not merely curiosities. They are the last will and testament of a world we have forgotten, a silent challenge to everything we thought we knew about our past. We have sailed across a world of impossible coastlines and sailed in the wake of forgotten navigators. From the Piri Reis maps vision of a green Antarctica to the Zeno charts island of Greenland, these 30 documents form a constellation of evidence that cannot be dismissed. The phantom islands of the North Atlantic, like Friesland and Antillia, were not mere fantasies but navigational markers for a clandestine trade route already bustling with activity. The Cognito map revealed a global network of knowledge that connected Asia to Africa long before European ships arrived, while the deep charts like Jean Rotz's atlas depicted the coast of Australia 60 years before its official discovery. The Jorge Rienel chart showed the Strait of Magellan a year before Magellan found it, and the Buach map correctly theorized Antarctica's split nature 2 centuries before our technology confirmed it. Each chart in its own way points to a single staggering reality. Our history books are not wrong about everything, but they are missing a volume, a prologue that tells of a seafaring culture with the skill to map the entire globe. They possessed a science of longitude and spherical trigonometry that we would not rediscover for hundreds of years, and their master blueprint of the world was copied, traded, and hidden, its fragments surfacing again and again in the hands of medieval and Renaissance cartographers who could not understand the ancient world they were redrawing. So the question we are left with is not which map is the most convincing, but what does it mean for our understanding of human history if this lost civilization truly existed? Which of these 30 charts do you find most compelling, and what forgotten explorer do you think deserves to be remembered? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to join us as we continue to explore the deepest mysteries of our past.